Some heroes never bark. They just wait until someone listens. That line, scribbled at the bottom of a weathered photograph, became the beginning of something unforgettable. Welcome to Vale Marks, where we share the stories that often go untold. Stories of love, loss, courage, and quiet redemption. In today's video, you're about to witness a tale that reaches deep into memory, into silence, into the bond between a grieving man and a scarred old dog that refused to give up. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson, a heartbeat, a legacy. Watch until the very end. The ending might just change the way you see strength forever. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, Texas, casting long golden rays across fields of dry grass and wooden fences bleached white by time. It was the kind of town where the diner still served coffee in chipped mugs, where porch swings creaked slowly in the breeze, and where folks spoke more with nods than words. Time didn't rush in Willow Creek. It lingered, like dust in a sunbeam. 10-year-old Lily Bennett sat in the passenger seat of an old Ford pickup, her feet not quite touching the floor, her hands gripping the frayed edge of a pink backpack. Her eyes were fixed out the window, watching rows of oak trees blur by as the truck rumbled down a narrow country road. Next to her sat her grandfather, Walter Bennett, his calloused hands steady on the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the road ahead. Walter had been many things in his life. A firefighter, a soldier, a father, and now, unwillingly, a grandfather. After losing his wife to cancer and his only son in a military operation overseas, he had retreated into a life of silence and routine. He cooked the same meals, walked the same trails behind the house, and listened to the same AM radio station every morning at 6. Lily was the only reason he still kept the truck running. She had moved in with him a year ago after the accident took her mother. The court called it placement with next of kin. Walter called it the world's cruel way of reminding him he was still here. They weren't headed anywhere special that afternoon. At least, that's what Walter thought. But Lily had begged him all week to take her to the local animal shelter, whispering promises of just looking, not touching, and definitely not bringing anything home. Walter didn't trust promises from children, but something in her eyes, a spark of something he couldn't name, had worn him down. The shelter sat on the edge of town, a low, weathered building with a faded sign that read, Willow Creek Animal Rescue. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and damp fur. Barking echoed through the hallway as a teenage volunteer led them past rows of kennels, each one holding a dog more eager than the last, jumping, spinning, tails wagging frantically against chain-link fences. But Lily didn't stop for the barkers or the tail waggers. She kept walking, past the puppies, the shepherds, the labs with hopeful eyes, until she reached the end of the hallway, where the light dimmed and the barking faded into a heavy, weighted silence. There, in the last cage, lay a Pitbull unlike any she had ever seen. He was curled in the corner of his kennel, his body scarred and lean, his coat a dull reddish-brown marked with old wounds. One ear stood half-cocked while the other drooped completely. His eyes, a soft and tired amber, didn't move when she approached. He didn't bark. He didn't lift his head. He simply stared at the floor, as if hope had packed its bags and left a long time ago. Walter stopped a few feet behind her, arms crossed over his chest. "Keep walking, Lily," he said gruffly. "That one's seen things. You can tell." Lily didn't move. She crouched down, gripping the metal bars, eyes locked on the dog's still form. The tag above the kennel read, Rosco, male, approximately. 9 years, returned twice. The volunteer caught up with them, her tone suddenly softer. "He's been here a while," she said. "Not many people ask about him. He's a little shut down." "Is he mean?" Lily asked without looking away. "No," the girl replied. "Just quiet." Walter huffed. "Means he's hiding something." Lily turned slowly and looked up at her grandfather. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "He looks like he's stopped hoping," she said, her eyes sad and strangely certain. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Just like you." Walter's jaw tightened. He looked away, the fluorescent lights catching the silver in his beard. He didn't respond. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of electricity and the soft rustle of paws shifting behind the kennels. Lily stood up and stepped closer to the cage. She took off her backpack and unzipped it slowly, pulling out a small plastic container of leftover chicken. She didn't open the door. She simply sat cross-legged in front of the cage and set the food down within reach. Roscoe didn't move. She waited anyway. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe 10. Walter checked his watch twice. The volunteer hovered awkwardly nearby. Then finally, the Pitbull lifted his head. Just slightly. His nose twitched, barely perceptible, and then, as if it took everything he had, he pulled himself forward one paw at a time until he reached the food. He didn't eat greedily. He simply nibbled, his eyes flicking once to Lily's face before settling back on the floor. Lily smiled. It was the first real smile she'd shown in weeks. Walter saw it, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't see a lost little girl sitting on the floor of a shelter. He saw his granddaughter. And a dog that had given up. And a moment between them that somehow made the air feel warmer. He didn't speak again until they were back in the truck. Roscoe curled quietly in the truck bed behind them, wrapped in an old army blanket Walter hadn't used since 1987. Lily rested her head against the window, eyes heavy with something deeper than sleep. Walter gripped the steering wheel, the road blurring in the golden light ahead. "He'd better not pee on the porch," he muttered. Lily smiled again, eyes still closed. "I think he's just glad someone came back for him," she whispered. And somehow, though he didn't say a word, Walter knew exactly what she meant. The first night Roscoe came home, he didn't bark, didn't whine, and didn't wag his tail. He simply lay in the corner of the living room, curled up on an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs, his amber eyes tracking every movement without a sound. The house was quiet anyway. Too quiet, really. It was the kind of silence Walter Bennett had grown used to, a stillness he carried like a coat he could no longer take off. But now, with Roscoe in the house, it was a different kind of silence. Not emptiness. Something heavier. Walter watched the dog from his recliner, arms crossed over his chest, the flickering light from the muted television casting long shadows on the floor. Roscoe didn't sleep. He didn't eat either, not even the bowl of beef stew Lily had left out for him before going to bed. At some point, a car drove by outside, its engine a low growl in the distance. Roscoe flinched. Not visibly, not in a way most people would notice, but Walter did. The slight twitch of a muscle along the dog's back, the flick of his ears, the way his tail pressed tighter to his side. It wasn't fear. It was memory. Walter had seen it before, years ago, in fire stations and on battlefields, in the haunted eyes of young men who'd come home but never really returned, eyes that had looked just like Roscoe's. The next morning, Walter said nothing when Lily asked if Roscoe had eaten. She dropped to her knees by the dog, scratched gently behind his ears, and whispered something too quiet for Walter to hear. Roscoe didn't react, but he didn't move away either. And that was something. Days passed. Roscoe never barked. He rarely left the corner of the living room unless Lily called him, and even then it was slow, hesitant. He avoided the kitchen when pots clanged. He froze during thunderstorms, unmoving except for a faint tremble in his hind legs. When Walter turned on the vacuum, Roscoe slunk away with his head low and ears back, disappearing beneath the porch until the noise stopped. Still, Walter didn't complain. Not even when Roscoe refused to go outside to relieve himself unless Lily walked him. Not even when the dog tracked muddy paw prints across the rug his wife had once adored. Because for reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, he understood the silence. And maybe, just maybe, Roscoe understood his. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the air took on that dry golden hush of Texas twilight, Walter settled into his porch chair with a worn paperback in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other. The radio on the windowsill crackled to life, its dial stuck permanently on the AM station that played nothing but war-era jazz and old talk shows. It had been his companion for over a decade. Roscoe wandered out after Lily had gone to bed, his nails clicking softly on the wooden planks. He didn't come looking for attention. He simply sat beside the chair and looked out at the fields like he belonged there. Like he always had. Walter didn't say a word. He didn't have to. There was something sacred about two quiet souls sharing a sunset. That night, Walter dreamed. It had been years since he'd seen his son's face so clearly. The way he smiled without showing teeth, the crooked dimple in his left cheek, the crease that formed above his brow when he was deep in thought. In the dream, his son stood in uniform at the edge of a field, sunlight spilling behind him like fire. He said something Walter couldn't make out, something important, but before Walter could answer, a sharp cracking sound split the sky, then darkness, then silence. He awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unsure for a moment where he was. And then he felt the weight. Heavy. Solid. Real. Roscoe. The dog had climbed onto the rug beside his bed during the night and was now resting his head on Walter's foot. His breath was slow and even, his body warm. The steady rhythm of it grounded Walter in a way nothing else had in years. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, in the dark, watching the quiet dog at his feet, and wondered if maybe this presence, this silent understanding, was something close to healing. The following morning, Walter poured 2 cups of coffee. He didn't think about it. He placed one on the table beside his own and set the other on the floor near Roscoe's quilt. It wasn't coffee, of course, just warm water with a dash of chicken broth, but Roscoe sniffed it and drank. Later that week, Walter found himself talking again, not to Lily, not to the neighbor who always waved from the mailbox, but to Roscoe. Little things at first. Remarks about the weather, complaints about the arthritis in his knee, grumbles about the state of the world and how no one made good boots anymore. Roscoe never responded, but he listened, and that, Walter realized, was more than enough. He started taking Roscoe with him on his morning walks to the edge of the property. The Pitbull didn't tug at the leash, didn't chase birds, didn't bark at passing trucks. He simply walked beside him, matching his pace, glancing up now and then as if to check Walter was still there. He always was. Sometimes at night, Lily would find the two of them on the porch, Walter dozing lightly in his chair and Roscoe lying next to him, one paw resting over the man's boot. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because some friendships don't start with words. They begin with scars, shared silences, and the slow, unspoken promise that says, "I won't leave you behind." The attic hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated every box like a second skin. The old pull-down ladder creaked beneath Lily's weight as she climbed, flashlight in hand, her curiosity sparked by the stories Grandpa Walter never told and the corners of the house that always felt off-limits. She wasn't supposed to be up here, not really. But something had drawn her in. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the scent of old wood and forgotten time. Or maybe, in the quiet way children sometimes just know things, she sensed there was something waiting to be found. She swept the beam of light across cardboard boxes, some labeled Ismas, others simply marked with faded dates. In the far corner, tucked beneath an old fireman's jacket and a stack of worn blankets, she spotted it. A small, dented tin box, the kind her mother used to keep keepsakes in. Lily pulled it out gently, brushing away cobwebs. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, its latch rusted but still holding strong. She sat cross-legged on the floor and pried it open. Inside were pieces of a life long buried. A faded photograph lay on top, creased at the corners, its color softened by time. In it, her father stood in uniform, crouched beside a muscular pit bull, one arm draped around the dog's shoulders. Both man and dog looked straight into the camera with the same kind of focus, serious, steady, unblinking. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen pictures of her dad before, of course, but not like this. Not this young, not this alive. She traced his face with a fingertip, then turned her attention to the dog beside him. There was something eerily familiar in the shape of its head, the slight droop of its left ear, and most of all, the white V-shaped patch of fur on its chest. The next item in the box was a medal, a small circular bronze disc with the letters K9 unit etched into the center. It was attached to a ribbon frayed at the edges. Lily turned it over. On the back was a single engraved name, Rosco. She froze. Digging deeper, she found a weathered document folded several times over. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Medical records, transfer notes, handwritten evaluations, at the top in black typewritten letters. Subject, Rosco, presumed KIA, presumed killed in action. Lily sat motionless, the weight of the tin box suddenly heavier in her lap. Her mind spun. The Rosco who slept at the foot of her bed. The one who flinched at loud sounds, who didn't bark, who walked like he remembered landmines beneath his paws. Was he really the same dog from this photograph? She climbed down from the attic, clutching the box to her chest, her heart pounding. Walter was on the porch, his old boots propped on the railing, radio buzzing beside him. The sun had nearly set, bathing the land in gold and blue shadows. "Grandpa," Lily said quietly, stepping out. "I found something." He looked over his shoulder. One glance at the box in her arms, and the expression on his face shifted, softened, and then braced itself like a man stepping into a memory he wasn't ready for. He didn't speak as she opened the box in front of him, laying the contents out one by one on the side table. But when she handed him the photograph, his hand shook. Walter stared at the picture in silence. His thumb brushed over his son's face, then slowly slid down to the dog beside him. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. Then his eyes locked onto the white V-shaped mark on the dog's chest. "That's your victory badge, son," he whispered. An old joke spoken aloud for the first time in years. His voice cracked. The words were barely audible. His eyes, for the first time in front of Lily, filled with tears. Walter reached into the photo box, pulling out old letters, some written by his son during deployment, some unopened. He flipped through them with shaking hands, searching for something he hadn't been ready to see before. Then, in one small leather-bound field journal, he found it. A single line, scrawled in his son's unmistakable handwriting. "If anything happens, he knows how to come home." Walter pressed the page closed and leaned back in his chair. He looked out over the fields, his breath catching in his throat. "It can't be," he murmured. Unless he made it out." He stood up suddenly, his bones groaning with age, and walked back into the house. Lily followed. Roscoe lay on the rug by the fireplace, dozing peacefully. At the sound of footsteps, he opened his eyes. Amber eyes. Tired, but alive. Walter approached slowly, kneeling down beside him. His hands reached out, tentative, until they rested lightly on the pit bull's head. Roscoe didn't flinch. Walter gently lifted the dog's front paw, and there it was, the scar, jagged but healed, running along the same back leg shown in the photograph. No longer just a dog from the shelter, not a stray, not a ghost. Roscoe had made it out of hell and come home. Walter exhaled, a deep, soul-weary breath. He looked at Lily, his voice barely above a whisper. He was supposed to be dead. Lily knelt beside him, wrapping one arm around Roscoe, the other around her grandfather's shoulder. "But he's not," she said quietly. "He's here. With us." And for the first time in years, Walter believed that maybe, just maybe, some things lost could still be found. It was just after midnight when the wind picked up. The old trees behind the house groaned softly, branches brushing against the windows like fingertips dragging across glass. Inside, the Bennett farmhouse lay in deep quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after years of loss and routine, when even silence becomes a companion. Walter was in his armchair, half asleep with a blanket over his knees, a book resting open on his chest. The fire in the hearth had burned down to faint orange embers, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor. Upstairs, Lily was sleeping soundly, her bedroom door left slightly ajar. Roscoe lay at the foot of the stairs, his usual spot, curled into himself, breathing steady. Then came the sound, not loud, not crashing, just deliberate. The metallic click of a latch turning. The back door. Roscoe was on his feet before Walter's eyes had even opened fully. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep in his chest, nothing like the soft, tired sounds he usually made. This was sharp, primal, warning. Walter sat up instantly, heart thudding. He reached under the side table and pulled out the shotgun he hadn't fired in over a decade. His hands were steady. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had learned a long time ago that fear came second to instinct. The back door creaked open slowly, as if someone on the other side wasn't in a hurry, someone confident. Then came the footsteps. One pair, heavy. Roscoe barked once, loud, fierce, and filled with purpose, then launched toward the kitchen, nails scraping across the floorboards. Walter followed, shotgun raised. By the time he reached the doorway, Roscoe had the intruder cornered against the pantry. He didn't lunge. He didn't bite. But his body was tense, poised, eyes locked on the man like he recognized him. Walter flicked on the kitchen light. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark windbreaker and jeans, civilian clothes. But his stance, his presence, gave him away. Military, no question. His face was expressionless, but his hands were raised slightly, not in fear, but caution. He didn't look at Walter first. He looked at Roscoe. "Call him off," the man said calmly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Walter didn't lower the gun. "That's funny. Most folks don't break in through the back door if they're just stopping by for coffee." The man nodded once. "Fair." Walter took a step closer, watching his every move. "Start talking." The man slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "I have ID," he said. "Going for my wallet." Roscoe growled louder. "Easy, boy," Walter muttered. The man pulled out his wallet and tossed it onto the table. Walter stepped over, keeping the shotgun leveled, and flipped it open. There, behind a few folded bills, was a laminated identification card. A name. A badge. A logo Walter didn't recognize at first, but his gut twisted the moment he read the words. Redstone Initiative. Private Medical Operations Division. He looked up sharply. "What the hell is Redstone?" The man exhaled through his nose. "We're not the enemy, Mr. Bennett. We work under federal contract, specialized recovery and research." "You break into people's homes to recover research?" Walter shot back. "We're looking for a subject," the man said plainly. "A dog. K9 unit. Designation, Roscoe." He glanced down at the Pitbull, who still hadn't backed away. His amber eyes locked onto the stranger like he was reading a language only they knew. "Where's the dog?" the man asked again, more quietly this time. "We believe he was relocated to this area recently." Walter stepped forward, voice steady. "Why?" The man hesitated. "Because he was never supposed to be released. He was part of a long-term behavioral and neurological trial. Government-funded. Controlled access." "You mean he was experimented on?" Walter growled. Like a damn lab rat. The man's expression didn't change. He's valuable, and we need him back. Walter shook his head slowly. You had your chance. He came back on his own. He doesn't belong here, the man said flatly. Walter took another step closer, barrel aimed squarely at the man's chest. He belongs here more than you ever will. For a moment, no one moved. The kitchen clock ticked somewhere behind them. The fridge hummed. Roscoe didn't blink. Then the man shifted, subtly. Just a twitch. But Roscoe surged forward with a snarl, and the stranger froze. Walter tightened his grip on the shotgun. Get out! The man opened his mouth to protest, but whatever he saw in Walter's eyes, grief, rage, love, made him think twice. He backed toward the door. I won't be the last, he warned. Others will come. They won't knock. I won't wait, Walter replied. The man disappeared into the night. Walter locked the door behind him, bolted it, then stood there for a long time, staring at the knob. Roscoe pressed up beside him, tail still. Walter looked down at the dog, his son's dog, a survivor of something they hadn't begun to understand yet. He reached down and scratched gently behind Roscoe's ear. They're not taking you, he said softly. Not this time. And deep inside him, where the ache of fatherhood never really healed, something fierce and bright flickered to life. He had already lost one family to duty, secrets, and silence. He wasn't about to lose another. The morning after the break-in, Walter didn't say much. He sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee untouched in front of him, eyes staring out the window as if waiting for the trees to whisper something back. Roscoe lay near his feet, silent as ever. But his ears twitched at every creak of the floorboards, every distant engine that passed on the main road. Lily watched them both from across the room, her hand resting on the old tin box they had unearthed just days before. Inside was still that photo, her father and Roscoe, side by side, and the single line that had changed everything. If anything happens, he knows how to come home. Now, more than ever, that sentence felt like a secret barely beginning to unravel. Later that day, after checking the locks again for the third time and making sure Roscoe hadn't been tagged with any kind of tracker, Walter opened a box from the hall closet, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were faded contact lists, a tangle of old numbers, names of people who had disappeared into the fog of war or the silence of time. He thumbed through until one stood out. Martha Diaz. Walter hesitated before picking up the phone. She had been a war correspondent once. Brave, relentless, the kind of woman who asked questions no one else dared to. She had embedded with Walter's son's unit more than once. And more than that, she had been there during the final deployment. If anyone still remembered what happened to Roscoe after everything fell apart, it was her. Martha answered after 2 rings. Walter Bennett, she said without needing to ask. It's been a long time. I need to talk, he said, about Roscoe and about my son. There was a pause. Then, quietly, come see me. Now. Her house sat on the edge of town, not far from the abandoned airfield. She lived alone now. Retired, she said, though Walter didn't believe she'd ever really stop chasing stories. Not a woman like her. They sat in her living room, the walls covered with framed front pages, photos from deserts and jungles, riots and rescue missions. Martha poured strong black coffee and listened as Walter explained everything. The shelter, the photo, the break-in, the man from Redstone. When he finished, she leaned back and sighed. Her face, lined and weathered from years in harsh places, softened. I always wondered what happened to that dog, she murmured. So it was him? Walter asked. She nodded. Yes, that's Roscoe, your son's dog. And he didn't die over there. He was taken. She stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. From it, she pulled a folder labeled in red marker, Project Templar. She handed it to Walter. It was a program no one was supposed to know about. Started quietly after a few of us reported on how service dogs were coming back from war just as broken as their handlers. Some bright minds pitched a solution, therapy through neurological reconditioning, reprogramming trauma, basically. Walter flipped through the pages, diagrams, memos, contracts. "And Roscoe?" he asked. "He was one of the first dogs brought into the trials," Martha said. "Voluntarily at first, but when the results didn't come fast enough, they pushed harder. He wasn't just retrained, he was altered, chemically, behaviorally. There were side effects, bad ones. One dog turned on its handler. Another stopped eating and died of internal shutdown." Walter looked down at Roscoe, now lying quietly at his side, unaware that his own life had been part of some forgotten experiment. "Why didn't they tell us?" Walter asked. "Why wasn't his name cleared?" Martha gave a bitter smile. "Because the program was shut down, and everything was sealed. Redstone and its partners erased the records, made sure no one could trace the results back to them, not the failed dogs, not the successful ones, especially not the only one who might have survived it all." Lily, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly perked up. "His collar," she said. "There's something in his collar." Walter looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I saw a bulge near the seam the other day," Lily said. "Didn't think much of it." Martha reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small utility knife. "Let's find out." With gentle hands, she turned Roscoe's collar inside out and carefully sliced along the lining. A tiny black object fell into her palm. No bigger than a thumbtack, a micro drive. Martha plugged it into a reader. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice, crackled, strained, but unmistakably human. It was Lily's father. The recording was dated just 3 days before his final mission. "They're pushing us too far. Command knows these orders don't make sense. I've sent 3 reports, no answers, and now they want Roscoe reassigned to Redstone. I don't trust them. I don't trust what they're doing to him." Another pause. Then his voice again, quieter now. "If anything happens, he knows how to come home." The room went still. Walter's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles pale. "He tried to warn us," he whispered. "He knew they'd cover it up." Martha's eyes were wet. "This could be everything, Walter. This recording? This proves negligence. A cover-up. Maybe even criminal conduct." Walter looked down at Roscoe. Scarred, silent, loyal as ever. "We're not hiding anymore," he said. "We make this public." Martha nodded slowly. "And we make them answer for it." The highway out of Austin was mostly empty. The kind of road where the radio barely held a signal and the pine trees stood tall and watchful on either side. Walter gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The old pickup rattled along the uneven shoulder, dust rising behind it like smoke. Roscoe lay in the back seat, calm but alert, his eyes scanning the windows, his ears twitching at every sudden shift in the wind. Beside Walter sat Martha Diaz, holding tight to the small metal micro drive like it was more fragile than glass. The plan had been simple. Leave the city, get to the next safe location, upload the evidence, and blow the lid off what Redstone had done. But plans didn't mean much once people realized what you were carrying. Lily was staying with a friend of Martha's in town. Safer that way. Walter had insisted. The first sign of trouble came just before dusk. A black SUV pulled in behind them, following too closely, no headlights. Then another appeared behind it. Walter's heart sank. He pressed the gas pedal, but the pickup was old and tired. It didn't have the strength for a chase. When the van appeared in front of them, blocking the road, Walter knew they were boxed in. "Hold on," he muttered. He swerved off the highway into the brush. Tires bumped over roots and gravel, trees scraping the sides as the truck dove into the forest trail. Martha held on to the dashboard, Roscoe bracing himself with a low growl building in his throat. But they didn't get far. A gunshot rang out, loud and sharp, shattering the back windshield. The truck swerved hard and slammed into a fallen tree, jerking to a stop. Walter's head hit the steering wheel, his vision blurred. The door yanked open. Rough hands grabbed at him. He heard yelling. Orders barked in clipped tones, but everything sounded distant, like he was underwater. Then Roscoe moved. The Pitbull launched forward with a force Walter hadn't seen before. Years seemed to melt off him in a single fluid motion. He went straight for the nearest attacker, jaws bared, teeth flashing. The man screamed and fell back, clutching his arm. Gunfire cracked through the trees. Walter tried to get up, but his leg wouldn't move. Pain flared in his side. He'd been hit. "Go!" He tried to yell, but his voice came out a rasp. Roscoe was at his side in seconds. Blood stained the Pitbull's shoulder, but he didn't slow. He grabbed Walter's jacket collar gently in his teeth and began to pull, inch by inch, dragging him away from the wreckage, from the men, from the shouting. Leaves and mud clung to Walter's clothes. His breath came in shallow gasps, but Roscoe didn't stop. Not when another bullet hit a tree inches from them. Not when a root caught his paw and made him stumble. Not even when more blood began to spill from a fresh cut along his leg. He pulled Walter past the underbrush, into the deeper woods, where shadows swallowed the light and the silence returned. They collapsed together near a moss-covered log, lungs heaving, bodies trembling. Walter reached up with a shaking hand and laid it gently on Roscoe's neck, feeling the pulse of life still there, still fighting. His voice cracked. "I lost my son to silence," he whispered. "But you never stopped carrying his voice." Roscoe leaned into him, head resting on Walter's chest. The dog's breath was warm, steady, alive. Somewhere in the distance, tires screeched. More voices. Then silence again. Martha emerged minutes later, bruised but unbroken. She knelt beside them, one hand pressed to Roscoe's wound, the other checking Walter's side. "We have to move," she said, but Walter shook his head. "No more running." He handed her the micro-drive, smudged with blood but still intact. "Go. Finish what we started." She looked at him. This tired old man, bleeding in the dirt beside a dog who had no business still being alive, and nodded. "I will." By nightfall, the story had broken. Martha uploaded the recording to 3 different outlets. Within hours, it was spreading across social media. The voice of Walter's son, calm, clear, and damning, filled television screens and news feeds. He spoke of the program, of the secrecy, of the danger, of Roscoe, and the final line hit hardest. "If anything happens, he knows how to come home." The world listened. Veterans spoke up. Whistleblowers came forward. The name Roscoe trended on every platform, no longer as a stray from a forgotten shelter, but as a survivor, a symbol. Back in the woods, Walter sat with Roscoe beneath a starlit sky, his blood crusted to his sleeve, his bones aching with age and pain. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel helpless. He felt heard. Roscoe stirred beside him, tail thumping weakly against the ground. "You did good, boy," Walter said softly. "You brought him home. And maybe, just maybe, you brought me back too." 6 months passed, and spring returned to Willow Creek. The world had moved on, as it always does. News stories faded, investigations slowed, headlines changed. But in one quiet corner of Texas, something enduring had taken root. Not a monument, not a plaque, but a promise. Walter Bennett stood in the doorway of the old woodshed behind his house, the same one that once held rakes, busted lawn chairs, and forgotten tools. Now it held something else. Rows of handmade dog beds lined the walls, each with its own small nameplate. The air smelled of cedar shavings and warm hay. Light streamed through the windows, catching dust motes as they danced in the stillness. Above the entry hung a hand-carved wooden sign, sanded smooth by Lily herself. Hero's Yard, where old souls rest. What had once been a place for firewood and spiderwebs was now a sanctuary for retired military dogs, those who had served, survived, and outlived the missions that once defined them. Here, they had a second chapter. Not one filled with drills or sirens, but soft grass, warm sun, and gentle hands. On that particular morning, the gate creaked open and a small group of visitors wandered in. Most were veterans, their hats tilted low, some walking with canes, others leaning on the strength of old routines. A few came with dogs of their own, service animals, rescues, or just lifelong companions. They didn't come for attention. They came for peace. Under a wide oak tree near the back of the yard, a folding table stood with a chipped domino set. Two elderly men in matching navy jackets slapped down pieces with the kind of gruff affection only time could build. Laughter mingled with the breeze. Near the fence, a woman in her 70s tossed a ball gently for a three-legged Labrador who chased it with the kind of joy that didn't seem to notice what was missing. Lily sat cross-legged on the porch, a faded photograph resting on her lap. She traced her fingers over the image, her father in uniform, kneeling beside a younger Roscoe, his arm slung around the dog's shoulder. She had added something to the bottom in her own neat handwriting. Some heroes never bark. They just wait until someone listens. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Walter stepped out with 2 glasses of sweet tea, settling into the rocking chair beside her with the groan of old wood and older bones. Roscoe lay stretched beneath his chair, breathing slow, his muzzle more silver than brown now, but his eyes still alert. He had been honored last month at a small but heartfelt ceremony at the local courthouse. The mayor had stumbled a bit over the formal language, but no one seemed to mind. When they placed the medal around Roscoe's neck and named him Veteran Dog of Honor, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Walter hadn't cried in public in over 30 years. That day, he did. Now, here in the stillness of their backyard-turned haven, Roscoe spent his days napping in the sun, greeting new arrivals with a sniff and a wag, and occasionally nudging Walter's hand when the silence got too heavy. "He's dreaming," Lily said, nodding to Roscoe. The dog's paws twitched lightly in his sleep, tail giving a soft wag. "Probably chasing a memory," Walter replied, his voice warm. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere a screen door slammed in the distance. Birds chirped lazily overhead. A boy and his grandfather walked through the yard toward them, the boy holding a leash connected to a scarred old German shepherd with cloudy eyes. Walter stood to greet them, extending a firm handshake. "You're welcome here," he said simply. The boy smiled. "He doesn't play much anymore," he said, patting the dog's shoulder. "Doesn't have to," Walter answered. "He's earned the right to just be." Lily smiled and turned back to her photo. Sometimes it still hit her, what they'd all gone through. The fear, the running, the gunfire in the woods, the night Roscoe dragged Walter out of danger, bleeding but unstoppable, and the moment her grandfather, with tears in his eyes, had said those words. "I lost my son to silence. But you never stopped carrying his voice." She reached down and stroked Roscoe's fur, now coarse and warm beneath her fingertips. "You brought him home, didn't you?" she whispered. "Both of them." He stirred, lifting his head just enough to nuzzle into her palm before settling back down with a sigh. More people had started arriving now. A group from the VA hospital, a retired nurse with a poodle mix in a wheelchair, and a man who didn't say much but lingered near the fence with eyes full of memory. Hero's Yard was never loud. It wasn't built for noise. It was built for stories. Stories told in the gentle pat of a hand on fur. In shared silence between 2 soldiers who'd never met but somehow understood everything. in the soft thump of a tail when an old dog heard a familiar name. Walter looked around and took it all in, the yard, the people, the dogs, the peace. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the local newspaper. On the front page was a picture of Rosco wearing his medal, and the headline read, "Real strength is quiet." He handed it to Lily, who smiled and tucked it into her scrapbook. "I think he knew all along," she said. "Knew what?" "That he wasn't done yet." Walter leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment as the breeze lifted through the trees. "No," he said softly. "None of us are. Not until someone's finally listening." And there, in the heart of Texas, on a porch where stories breathed again, a scarred old dog rested his head beside the boots of a man who had lost too much and found his way back, not with noise, but with quiet, steady love, the kind that never leaves, the kind that stays. Some scars don't fade, but sometimes they become maps, guiding us back to what matters most. If this story moved you, even just a little, I invite you to leave a comment, subscribe to Veil Marks, and help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support isn't just a number. It's the reason I keep writing, keep sharing, and keep honoring the quiet strength in all of us. As the old saying goes, the bravest souls don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear fur. And sometimes they bring home more than just memories. They bring healing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story, where another quiet hero might just be waiting to be heard.